Because this is the first talk of many this year dealing with revolutions, I'm going to lead out with some conceptual question, which is, what is a revolution? And then I'll talk about some other questions like, what are different types of revolutions? Why do revolutions occur? Why can revolutions have such huge international effects sometimes? And then Professor Mecham will come up and he'll talk about the Arab uprisings in particular. So let me start off with the first question. What is a revolution? Does anybody want to try to answer that? What is a revolution? I'm throwing it out to you. Any ideas? Yeah.
I guess really basically you could say a change in the status quo.
A change in the status quo. There's one back here. Someone chicken out?
It's like that, but it focuses more on the presiding power, whether it's a cultural power or a governmental power, to create something entirely new and hopefully better.
Okay. Anyone else want to try? Yeah.
Radical shifts in the political arrangement of the people, either by violent or non-violent means.
Okay. Well, now let's go and see what scholars have to say. I mean, you hear this term a lot, revolution, and in the broadest sense, it means some drastic change, right? So we talk about the Industrial Revolution means that industrialization has fundamental changes in the nature of the economy, or the Nuclear Revolution changes the way great powers interact with each other, or the Information Revolution. I mean, what we're talking about today is our revolutions in the sense of trying to replace regimes, toppling governments. And one scholar's definition of it includes these aspects that I'm going to run through here. Efforts to transform the political institutions and justifications for a political authority in a society. Basically what this is saying is you're trying to institute a new way to legitimate power, a new way to right to rule, right? So for example, in the French Revolution, a regime which is formally based on sort of dynastic monarchy, that's what grounds its legitimacy, is replaced by a regime that bases its legitimacy on popular sovereignty. So usually in revolutions, there's this ideological component, right? Revolutions are accompanied by formal or informal mass mobilization. Revolutions aren't something that happen behind closed doors among a few elites. People are out in the streets. Revolutions encompass non-institutionalized actions. It's kind of a broad term. A lot of times this is interpreted to mean violence, but you don't necessarily have violence with revolutions. Sometimes we have peaceful revolutions where there's large-scale civil disobedience. Another characteristic is that it undermines existing authorities. So somehow existing authorities that were in charge are no longer in charge. Now, when one of these aspects of revolutions are missing, then people start to question whether there was really a revolution. So, for example, in the case of Egypt that we'll talk about, certainly the president, Mubarak, was displaced, but was the political regime displaced? And if it wasn't, can we really call that a revolution, or is it sort of a failed revolution? Now, let me talk briefly about what are different types of revolutions. We can categorize revolutions in terms of different ways they occur. So sometimes the revolt is going on primarily in cities, like in the Egyptian Revolution or the Iranian Revolution, or sometimes it's largely sort of a guerrilla force in the countryside, like the Chinese Revolution or the Cuban Revolution. Sometimes revolutions are largely violent, sometimes they're peaceful. Another way to categorize revolutions is by the regime that, the ideology of that legitimates the regime that eventually comes to power. So democratic regimes, fascist regimes, communist regimes, and so forth. I should also say, when I talked about how there's a new ideology that comes to power, oftentimes this is a process, and it's not clear what type of regime this is because the revolutionaries themselves are divided about what should come after the old regime. So, for example, in Egypt, you had political Islamists that wanted to see Mubarak gone, but you also had liberals, and they had different ideas of the type of regime that should replace the old one. Finally, another way to categorize revolutions is how much change happens. So there's a basic distinction here between political revolutions and social revolutions. In political revolutions, the existing regime, political regime, right, the government, is swept away. In social revolutions, it's not only the government that's replaced, the entire social order is overturned. So, for example, in the Russian Revolution, it's not just about the Bolsheviks taking over from the Tsar. The entire aristocracy is basically liquidated as the peasants seize the land, right? So there's a huge turning over of the social order. Now, as you can imagine, social orders or social revolutions are relatively rare. So this is one scholar's list of social revolutions. If I put up a list of political revolutions, it would be too small for you to see, but I just wanted you to get a sense of some of the cases here. Now, you notice the Arab Spring would not go on this list because some people doubt whether the political regime was replaced, let alone the social structure. The social structure wasn't really fundamentally changed by the Arab Spring. Well, it depends. Maybe something will happen in Syria that will change that. Now, why do revolutions occur? There is no one answer for why revolutions occur. It's not like all scholars agree, oh, this is why revolutions happen. And you can think of how there could be different causes for different cases. But let me just highlight a couple of trends in the literature. One is the shift from focusing on why people are mad to why regimes collapse. So, for example, one theory out there, it's called relative deprivation theory. It used to be sort of why people get upset, right? So when there's this intolerable gap between what you want and what you're getting, as that diverges, then people revolt. But scholars came along and said, well, people are mad all the time. Does that really explain why we have revolts or especially successful revolutions? What we really need to focus on is why regimes collapse. Another trend I'll point out is the focus on international factors in causing revolutions. So it used to be that people focused on, factors that happen within the state explain why there's a revolution in that state. But more and more scholars are pointing out how international factors cause revolutions. Does that make sense? So, an example of this is how the international competition breaks down the regime. Or another example that happened in the Arab Spring is how a revolution elsewhere will cause a demonstration effect, which will lead to a revolution in that other country, right? So scholars investigate why that's the case. What causes revolutions to be disruptive of international order? You can think of two basic perspectives on this. One perspective is that, well, when you have revolutions, oftentimes there's big changes in the power of the revolutionary state. And so the extent to which it changes the balance of power changes international politics. Now, I would disagree with that perspective. I think what determines whether revolutions are going to be disruptive to the international order is, for the most part, having to do with the ideology, specifically the question of when leaders fear that an ideology is going to spread. If leaders do fear that, then that can be very disruptive to the international order. Well, now I feel like I'm obligated to talk briefly about the Russian Revolution, right? Because right now we're living through the 100-year anniversary of the Russian Revolution to sort of illustrate some of the things I just said. So in the Russian Revolution in March of our calendar in 1917, that guy over there, Nicholas II, abdicated and was replaced by a provisional government, eventually led by that guy in the middle, Kerensky, until he was dethroned in November or October under the old Russian calendar. That's why it's called the October Revolution, when the Bolsheviks come to power. Anybody know who this guy is? Now, does anybody know who that guy is? That's actually Trotsky. Maybe you've heard of Trotsky. So scholars sometimes focused on the Bolsheviks to explain the Russian Revolution, but going back to what I said about the focus should be on why the old regime collapses, a lot of scholars would say don't focus on the Bolsheviks too much. What you really need to focus on is why the Tsarist regime collapses. And then going back to what I said about international factors causing revolutions, people would say, in order to explain why the Tsarist regime collapsed, you really need to focus on how the Russian regime is weakened by their involvement in World War I at the time. and how that leads to food shortages and unreliable military and so forth, and that's really why the Tsarist regime collapsed. In terms of the international effects, I would say that the primary way in which the Russian Revolution affects international politics is the fear that this is going to happen. This is a propaganda poster from the Bolsheviks that you see Lenin sweeping away the capitalists and the old monarchies, right? This idea of Bolshevism will spread like the plague. And you find these same fears of contagion in the Arab Spring, particularly among the Saudis. With that, I will turn it over to Professor Mecham.
Let me take you back a number of years ago, and many of you may remember these events and where you were. I remember I was on Christmas break from school in 2010, and something kind of interesting seemed to be happening in Tunisia. Tunisia is a country that I've loved for a long period of time. It was the first country I'd spent time in the Arab world. Very authoritarian country, historically. And there were protests going on that the government seemed to have a hard time controlling. And they stemmed from, at least initially, from a fruit seller named Mohammed Bouazizi, who was very frustrated with his economic situation in life. He was an educated guy. He was forced out into the street selling fruit, had to do it illegally, was being rounded up. He self-immolated. He started himself on fire. He was not the only one to do that. There were other people that did it, but this particular situation spread quite quickly through communication channels in Tunisia. More economic protests started to develop. The government sent out its security forces to try to repress them. It didn't work particularly well. And we started to see mass protests in one of the most authoritarian regimes in the Arab world. No one was paying too much attention to this because, hey, it was Christmas break after all. But suddenly, people like me who follow the Middle East started to think maybe this is something different than we've ever seen before. And we finally got a real sense of that when President Zine al-Abidine Ben Ali, the president of Tunisia, hopped on a plane and fled suddenly to Saudi Arabia, surprising a lot of people. And we had not seen that in the Middle East for a very long time. So suddenly the Middle East became kind of an interesting place if you were thinking about revolution or social movements or democratization. And it became really interesting for almost everyone in the Middle East once the end of January started rolling around and early February, and we got to see scenes like this out in central squares in Cairo with hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people out protesting. And we didn't know, as scholars, how this was going to turn out. We knew that the Middle East was a deeply repressive kind of place, and that protests in Egypt had never really succeeded as they've tried before. But the scale of this was different. And there was a little bit of anxiety and hope in the air. And I remember having a student of mine who's now a journalist in Cairo, just keeping tabs on every minute of how things developed in Egypt. And I remember February 11th, 2011. September 11th, 2001 is often a date that we remember quite well in the United States, but in the Middle East, February 11th, 2011, the day that President Mubarak of Egypt actually was deposed, was a moment where people saw something that they thought previously had been impossible. As someone who loves the Middle East a great deal, I actually got quite emotional about that. I remember I was driving to a conference in New Mexico, and tears came to my eyes thinking, I had no idea this was possible in a region that had been deeply authoritarian for so long. And that particular event sparked protests throughout the vast majority of the Arab world. And the spring of 2011 was one of the most disruptive, interesting, highly politicized, socially mobilized times in the history of the Middle East. And the Middle East has a revolutionary history to some extent. And I remember at the time we didn't quite know how to explain what was going on or how to feel about it, other than we learned some things here about how ordinary people on the streets in many Arab countries who hadn't been able to fully express their opinions because of closed media and because of lack of polling data really were willing to stick their neck out there to try to change their governments. And this was a surprise to some degree, because one thing that scholars of revolution understand quite well is that revolutions are deeply hard to predict. They tend to have a bit of a cascade momentum to them. It's not entirely clear why a revolution might take place in 2011 in the Arab world and not in 2009, for example, when things were quite quiet in many countries. And so this unpredictability of revolutions was really quite interesting, and nevertheless, we all tried to figure out how to explain it. Some of the stories that help to explain the causes of the Arab uprisings of 2011 go something like this, right? That this was a period of time of economic recession. You may remember the 2008-2009 recession in the United States. This had a strong impact on the economies of the Middle East. There was a particular impact on food prices, which affect the lower classes more than other people. We had a bunch of countries with aging leaders that were trying to maneuver successors, often their sons, as in the case in Egypt or in the case of Libya. And there was increasing political manipulation. In Egypt, for example, there had been some democratic opening to some degree in previous elections, but in 2010, it seemed to be closing up with the regime deciding that it was too risky to allow the opposition movements to play in free and fair elections. This is coupled with a deep demographic challenge with widespread youth frustration about housing, about the possibilities of marriage, about the possibilities of employment. And something new is starting to happen in the Middle East in this period of time that I think helps to enable some of these grievances to coalesce into forms of social protest. So smartphones were just beginning to become rather ubiquitous, particularly among the upper middle classes by 2011. Internet access had reached a pretty substantive share of the population. Social media, you may not remember, but social media hasn't been around forever, right? And 6 years ago, it was still quite new, but it was being used in interesting ways to start to coordinate expectations. And we had seen by this point a relative maturity of the Arabic language international cable networks. And the one you may be most familiar with is Al Jazeera, which has been sponsored by the country of Qatar for some time. But Al Jazeera led a revolution in Arab media that allowed Arabs in their own language to see what was going on in other countries and to get a wide range of diverse opinions about what was going on. And this shared language across most of the Arab world, coupled with these new mechanisms for coordination, for sharing insight and preferences, as well as learning from what other people are doing by turning on your TV. And you can be in Yemen and just turn on your TV in 2011 and see that you've got 1 million people out in Tahrir Square in Egypt, and you start to ask yourself, why aren't we doing that here? And the answer was, maybe we should. And so this unique period, I think, has some revolutionary characteristics. So much as Professor Nelson mentioned, there are debates as to whether or not the Arab uprisings could be called revolutions and how much impact they ultimately had. But at a very fundamental level, they had a ton of impact in terms of the number of people that participated, and several things were really new One was the speed at which there was an observation effect that kicked in as one country looked at another country, and by March and April of 2011, you had protests all around the Middle East, even in some of the more authoritarian countries where protests were smaller. In the monarchy of Bahrain, for example, you had tens of thousands of people huddling around the central square of the Pearl Roundabout there. It had spread even into places like Saudi Arabia and Oman and Jordan and Morocco, where this kind of protest was not quite as common historically. And so you end up having, in pretty short order, 4 presidents of Arab countries who are deposed in 2011. The president of Tunisia, the president of Egypt, the president of Libya, who was actually killed in a revolutionary conflict that emerges there, Muammar Gaddafi, and then the president of Yemen also is deposed toward the end of the year. And this creates a widespread panic among Arab leaders. It also creates some, interesting dynamics among protesters and what they can learn from one another. And, can this Arab revolution, kind of like the Bolshevik revolution that was mentioned, can this spread and can this take down monarchies that have been established for a very long time? There are several things that we observed that were quite new here. So one is this level of mass mobilization on behalf of regime change, I think, demonstrated that some of the lingering arguments about the Middle East, which is Middle Easterners are not really that interested in democracy, or Middle Easterners are not really that engaged in their civil societies, and the reason that the Middle East is not democratic is people don't care enough about, trying to become a democracy. Those arguments started to fade because you had people just out there asking for it, right? And in a country like Syria, people were being killed on a very regular basis to try to stand up for regime change. You also had militaries being forced into some very difficult decisions. In the case of Tunisia and in the case of Egypt, you saw that militaries had to decide, do we support the president's wish that we go out and we shoot people? Or do we say that our interests are better served in the long run by siding with the people and maybe asking our president to step aside? Let me share with you a couple of ways that regimes tried to respond to this very sudden mass mobilization. So I'd like you to think for a moment about you as the leader of an autocratic regime, which was the case for most of the Arab world at this particular period of time. You are facing an unprecedented challenge. Do you repress people, or do you listen to them and concede something? Maybe change some laws, maybe offer some economic concessions. Maybe if you're a resource-rich country, you can increase government salaries suddenly. You can give the military more of what they want. And in almost all these cases, regime leaders had to decide, what should our strategy be here? Many Arab leaders had habits of moving first to repression, but we actually see that it's not entirely clear, if you want to stay in power, what the right way to go is. Because if you repress, you're betting that you can scare people off the streets in a way that is more powerful than the anger that you create with them. So when you repress someone, you're going to make them angry, right? But you're also going to make them scared. And if you want to stay in power, you want them to be more scared than they are angry. If you concede, you're making a different kind of bet, which is that you're saying, we can actually make you happier, we can increase your satisfaction. But the huge risk there is that you're going to want more, right? You're suddenly going to say, oh, well, if I get out here and protest, you're going to give me stuff, then I might as well come out tomorrow and see what else we can get. And so it was a really difficult decision for a lot of these leaders in terms of deciding what they want to do. And the problem with the leaders of Tunisia and in Egypt and the regimes there is that they they didn't have good information about which one would work better, and so they tried both. And they would try one day, and then they would, they'd repress a protest on a Friday, and then they'd come back up, and then they'd offer some political concessions, and they'd sack the prime minister or the cabinet or something. And it played what I call alternating strategies. And when you do that, guess what happens, right? You make people angry because you're repressing them, but you also make them hopeful because they're getting something. And if you want to stay in power, the last thing you want is to create a giant mass of angry, hopeful people. Right? That's what we ended up seeing to a large degree in the case of Tunisia and the case of Egypt. And Tunisia was considered pretty far out there in the Arab world. It's kind of a unique place and maybe not as relevant to Syria and other places. But once this happened in Egypt, everybody started waking up, all these authoritarian leaders, and they decided we need a better strategy than this if we're going to survive. So one way of thinking about what happened in 2011 was that you had this mass political shock of people out in the streets demanding real substantive change. And they repressed early on because that's what they did, but then they decided this is not working because the protests are continuing and growing, and so they had some political and economic concessions that they would offer. And those didn't really stop the protests either because every few days after that, people would come back out and say, that's not quite good enough, we need more. And so they turned to a much deeper and increased level of repression that started to consolidate their regimes. And this is not the case in every country, but in many countries it is, where suddenly they started taking more control away from the institutions of the rule of law and the court system. They started to shut down a lot of the media outlets. They started to try to take more control over the social media. And in many countries, we ended up in a place where there was a newly repressive status quo. So when you think back as to how people participating in these revolutions were feeling in 2011, there was a lot of hope, a lot of anger, a lot of room for change, and regimes had to try to figure out ways of managing that. And so now that we have 5 or 6 years, we can start to see some of the evolution of how this has taken place over time. You can see that the president of Yemen up here, Ali Abdel Saleh, wasn't very happy about what was happening in Egypt, and Bashar al-Assad, president of Syria, was really trying to keep his ear to the ground to see if this was going to take place in Syria, which it did. And we start to see in these cases that leaders don't play as much of the concession and repression alternating strategies, but they start to move in an increasingly repressive direction. If you look at, over time, 4 cases with a lot of popular mobilization: Bahrain, Egypt, Syria, and Yemen. And you just look at over the course of the full year, you can see that in the red line here, the case of Syria, that Syria just became more and more repressive as the year went on. In the case of Bahrain, they kind of bounced around a bit, and they offered some concessions and then became really repressive, then offered some more concessions in the summer, and then increasingly became repressive. And Yemen also started to deteriorate more and more toward a repressive strategy that started to take countries like Syria and Yemen into a place of civil war. So one of the legacies of the Arab uprisings has been state failure and deeply painful civil conflict in a number of countries, in particular in Syria and Yemen and in Libya, all of which are still engaged in civil wars to some degree. This is a graph that just shows you a little bit about when you average the kinds of strategies that these leaders took over the course of the year, right? Their initial inclination was maybe we should concede a little bit and see if we can start to limit these protests. And 2 countries did that with some effect. Jordan and Morocco actually offered a measure of political concessions. There were some constitutional reforms in Morocco, some changes in government in Jordan, and they were able to remain reasonably stable during this year. But most countries decided to move much more in a repressive direction. Let's imagine that you are a wealthy oil country that's a monarchy. You have a different set of options than a country that's reasonably poor. And so in the case of Qatar, which is the wealthiest country in the world on a per capita basis, the government decided to preemptively just make it so that no one had any interest in protesting. And one day you woke up in Qatar, and if you were a government employee, you had a 50% raise. That's everybody, unless you were in the military. And if you were in the military, you actually got your salary doubled overnight. And that was a way of shifting incentives. So when you're a Qatari citizen and you say, well, I could go to prison and lose my citizenship and be, ostracized by my family, or I could just get a 50% raise tomorrow. It started to shift incentives in terms of how people thought about protesting over time in those relatively rich countries. And in countries like Saudi Arabia, you also had this economic, some people would say it's a little bit of a buy-off of some of its potential opposition, coupled with some repression that targeted specific minorities and others that were more likely to go out and protest, like the Shia in the East. So what was not new over time, we learned from the Arab uprisings, is that these militaries and ruling elites really tried to spend some time thinking about how to protect their interests over the long haul. And in the case of Egypt, military decided to sacrifice President Mubarak and allow for elections to take place, but in a way that would allow them to still maintain significant economic interests and political options in the future. So these authoritarian leaders tended to learn from their own experience as well as from the experience of others over time. We had some things that were really quite interesting as a result of the Arab uprising in terms of the way society started to become integrated into politics. So in a country like Tunisia and in Egypt, as well as some others, Islamists, people that believed that Islam had a role to play in politics, had new openings and new avenues to participate in society and in politics in ways that they ever had before. So the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt is a classic example, competed in elections. They actually won those elections. Their candidate became president of Egypt for a short period of time before he was deposed by the military. Ennahda, an Islamist party in Tunisia, participated in government. They won the first elections and then participated in a coalition government after that. So you have a range of societal actors that start to engage in politics in new ways, which as a political scientist, we think that that's kind of interesting and exciting that more and more people can participate in politics. But it was also deeply threatening to elites, to militaries, and to many secularists who felt like their voice was being lost. And so there was a temptation that emerged, within the first year or so for a real counter-revolution to try to stop some of these changes. And that counter-revolution has largely continued over time. So we have now a number of countries that have moved into much more failed states where there's a lot of state weakness, and opposition groups have become much more mobilized in violent ways. We have a couple of countries that have experimented with new political reforms. Tunisia has probably been the most successful, where it has actually had 2 changes in government through democratic means since the Arab uprisings. And then we have countries like Egypt that have moved from some early democratic experimentation to a much more repressive approach. And Egypt today, unfortunately, has a worse human rights record and a worse political openness record than Egypt did before 2010. So one of the lessons of the Arab uprisings for me is that revolutionary outcomes are really quite unpredictable, and that you shouldn't underestimate the potential of elites to come back and to manipulate outcomes in the way that they want. Just a few conclusions before we move to questions. The Arab uprisings of 2011 and 12, I think, do have some similarity to other revolutions, some of the ones that Professor Nelson talked about, for example. But it's not entirely clear that we've had substantive regime change in most of the places that we look around that had these mass protests. And one question for you to think about is, why is that? And how have these regimes been able to dig in and consolidate? We've talked a little bit about how governments really struggled to know how to respond, and that some of their failure to figure out exactly what strategy that they were taking made it easy for these protests to spiral and to cascade over time. But that Arab governments on the whole have become increasingly repressive, and that the underlying grievances and revolutionary potential for people who see revolutions as coming from anger and a place of grievance, that's all still there, right? None of that has disappeared. What's really changing is these regime strategies to try to consolidate and to strip away some of that space for protesters to continue to organize and to continue to push. Oppositions also, in the course of this, discovered that they were quite split. Particularly the Islamist opposition, which is quite powerful in many Arab countries, had very different interests in some respects than some of the secular oppositions. And they had a difficult time working together over time, which has allowed the governments to sort of divide and conquer. I'm going to stop there, and we're going to turn time over to you. We've got about 15 minutes or so for questions, and we'll come up here and have a discussion.
So as has been said, now is the time for you to join in the conversation. For the benefit of those that are listening to this on BYU Radio or might watch it later on the web, we ask that you come up to the microphone here on this side and line up and ask your questions. Ask you to tell us your name, and if you're a student, what you're studying, and encourage you to keep the questions brief. So please line up and join the conversation. We can go for at least the next 10 minutes.
So I'm Dalton. I'm a Middle East Studies and Arabic major. And you were talking a bit more about how Syria and Yemen have particularly become more repressive since the revolutions. And we're seeing, I think, a lot of, news about, in Yemen in particular, there's a terrible famine. There's a terrible just situation in Yemen. What do you see as the connection between the outcomes of the revolution in Yemen and its present state as it stands?
Okay. Thank you. That's a really important question. For those of you that haven't been paying attention to Yemen, Yemen is one of the most fragile places right now where humanitarian crisis is indeed really, really deep, both with the cholera epidemic and with deep poverty and hunger. They're directly linked in part. And I think this raises a big question about the effects and power of revolutions over time. So the pro-democracy activists in Yemen were quite well known. They were quite well organized. There were major sit-ins for many, many months in Yemen to try to change a regime that was very autocratic. It also started to feed into existing divisions within the country. So tribal divisions to some extent also overlapped with religious divisions. There's a group known as the Houthis in the north of the country who felt very marginalized from what was happening in the central and south of the country. And those democratic negotiations for a new election, we actually never really got a fully new democratic election for a new president in Yemen. We had a referendum on one candidate. But different groups felt like they were marginalized from the governance process and decided to take matters into their own hands. And the Houthis attacked the capital and started a civil war. This triggered international reactions. This was considered threatening to the Saudis, who then started intervening and built a coalition to attack the rebels in Yemen. And it has turned into a failed state that's currently very, very divided. And so one lesson from revolution is that it does have international implications, right? The Saudis are going to respond directly to this. The Iranians were going to respond directly to this. And it starts to create a set of interests that go in, that start to move toward proxy wars, which we've seen also in Syria. So the tragedy of Yemen is in part that we had a very poor country in the Middle East, the poorest in the Middle East, that had potential for real democratic reform. That potential was in part hijacked by tribal interests and by international interests, and now we're in a civil war.
Actually, I have a follow-up question with that. Why do you think, at least from my perspective, why do you think it hasn't been as widely reported as, say, the situation in Syria, for example?
Two reasons. One is that Syrians can flee to Europe, and so people notice that better. Yemen is surrounded by desert and by the ocean, and you can flee to Somalia, which is not as compelling for Europeans to try to understand. The second reason is just that people in Yemen are very poor, the infrastructure is very bad, there are just very, very few journalists that even have access to Yemen, so we don't have a good set of people on the ground there to consistently report that conflict.
I'll just add really briefly that the Yemen case underlines that what I was saying about how not just focusing on how domestic causes lead to domestic outcomes, but international forces. Professor Mecham mentioned the Saudi policy, and you can't understand Yemen without understanding what the Saudis are doing there. But also the United States. The United States played a key role in forcing the president out in the early stages of what is now the Yemen civil war.
Thanks.
Okay. So you talked to
Name and major?
Dan Harker, Middle Eastern Studies, Arabic. You talked a little bit about how by a lot of standards, the revolutions in the Middle East during the Arab Spring weren't exactly successful, how they resulted in failed states or in just more repressive regimes. So I guess what would you say are some of the characteristics that tend to define quote-unquote successful revolutions, unlike these where you see a democratic government coming to power when you see like the standard of living actually increasing?
Okay. That's a broader question in political science about what makes revolutions successful over time. Even the revolutions that are the iconic revolutions, like the French Revolution, right, or the American Revolution, which again did not necessarily bring a new elite to power, but did change something substantively in this country. These kinds of revolutions had negative consequences as well. They tended to have periods of deep fear, of the terror in the French Revolution, for example. And they were successful at doing certain kinds of things. So they were successful at potentially realigning class structures. They were successful in potentially crafting a new constitution and a new set of political norms and institutions that could endure over time. If you look at the case of Tunisia, which again I think is a moderately successful case, some things that I think allow Tunisia to stand out are, number one, that its security services and its military were relatively professionalized compared to others that were deeply embedded in the economy and in politics. And so, their alliance and allegiance to the president was not quite as critical as it was in other countries. You also had a civil society, and this just means that people identified with one another. They had a lot of networks and things that they could leverage to build trust as they went forward. Trust is still in relatively short supply because of some of the challenges Tunisia's faced since the revolution. But there was more social trust and social networks to build on in ways. It was a more homogenous country than many countries in the Middle East are, like Syria, for example, which is extremely diverse, that I think created some of the fundamental structures that allowed Tunisia to be more successful than others. The thing that I always try to push when I think about what leads to successful governments over time is the role of institutions that really help to maintain the rule of law and to treat other people fairly. And the more we had a bureaucratic tradition in different countries in the Middle East, and some Middle Eastern countries have extensive bureaucratic traditions that have a mechanism to manage conflict through the rule of law, those tend to be much more successful over time.
Thank you.
My name's Thomas New. I'm a history major, and I was just curious because I had the same kind of question as well, like successful revolutions. And you mentioned something about like concessions versus repression. Do you think that? Also, I have two questions, and the first is: do you think that, for example, in Syria, with Assad, if he had been willing to give concessions and let the rule of law kind of prevail, do you think that that could have been, instead of what's obviously happened instead, do you think that the regime could have changed so drastically as to create a successful revolution, or would it have required his ousting, I guess?
Mm-hmm. In other words, could Assad have created a smooth path that would allow for democratic governance to evolve in Syria.
Or like any of these countries that we've talked about so far. Is there a way that the person, the elite, I guess, could have given concessions so as to, do that?
You want to say anything on that before I begin?
Well, no, I'll let you. It's a Middle East question. I'll let you.
Syria was always going to be a very difficult case. It had a long civil war in the 1960s. It's very fragmented among identity groups. The Assad family comes from a religious minority, the Alawites in Syria. There was a sense that if the popular will was fully represented in Syria, that the Sunni majority could really take it out on the Alawite minority that held the military power. So this, not unlike Iraq, where a Sunni minority was deposed and a lot of acts of revenge were taken on them by a Shia government, there was a clear fear that that could happen in the mirror image in Syria. So it was always going to be a difficult case. I don't want to be too pessimistic here, though, because I actually think that the Arab uprisings have taught us a few things. So one is that good leadership does matter. So if you are willing to compromise and to collaborate and to build coalitions and to tolerate other groups because you believe that they might be able to tolerate you, good things can happen. One of my favorite images in the last few years comes out of Tunisia, where the second democratic election in Tunisia, the ruling Islamist party, the Ennahda party, lost. And the head of that party, Rashid Ghannouchi, got on his phone and called up the winner, who was from the old regime, by the way, and said, "Congratulations, way to go. We're handing the keys back to you." And he did that in part because he had started to establish a culture whereby, Ennahda might be able to come to power again later on, right? Starting to craft a democratic political culture. Assad never tried to do that. Saleh never tried to do that in Yemen. And so I think that we've learned that people have enormous potential to push for change. We've learned that smart and thoughtful leaders can actually make a big difference in terms of the kind of institutions that they can create that might even constrain them. And those kinds of things, I think, can still evolve in the Middle East. This is not a hopeless region. It's just that it is very fragile and it's going to take some time.
So I would add to that to say, maybe Professor Mecham can disagree with me or whatever, but the initial protests in Syria were explicitly pan-sectarian. They knew this was an issue, and they were trying to say, we're just for democracy, and of course, if Assad was a beneficent guy and didn't mind stepping down from power, he could have turned the reins over and Syria would have had a fighting chance. But of course he did the opposite. He used sectarianism as a means to rally the minority religious groups on his side, and so he exacerbated any hope that Syria had. I guess I would also say in regards to successful revolutions, there's the question of what is a success, what are you defining success as, and then the time frame. So some people say, well, the French Revolution was a success that was realized in 1871 because that's when a republic was permanently established in France. And what happened in 1789 was just the start of a process. And in fact, there was a failed revolutionary wave in 1848 in Europe that looked a lot like the Arab Spring, and that was just a part of that process that eventually led to democratic rule in Europe.
I don't know if I have time for a second question.
Last one, yeah.
Okay, and then the second question is, it said in one of the bullet points about like international support, there's a lack of international support. And in this class that I took about the Arab Spring, we talked about this as well, but what to you would look like international support that maybe in the future, if something like this were to occur again, the international community could offer to create a successful revolution?
Yeah, again, it's about institution building and encouragement. It's helpful to some extent to think about 1989 in Eastern Europe, the fall of the Soviet Union, the collapse of communism in Eastern Europe, where you had a very similar wave of revolutionary movements that led to regime change across Eastern Europe. One of the huge advantages that those transitioning countries had is they were right next to the EU, right? And a broader Western Europe that was able and interested in integrating them. That has not been the case with the Arab world. If anything, their regional environment is quite hostile to these kinds of changes. Saudi Arabia has been an agent of conservatism here, right? Saudi Arabia invaded Bahrain to put down the revolution in Bahrain. Saudi Arabia currently is collaborating with Egypt and others to try to isolate Qatar, partly because there's a spat between the ruling families in that country, in those two countries, but partly because Qatar is seen as a potential revolutionary agent. It has Al Jazeera, right, that reports on the malfeasance of these various regimes and the corruption within them, and it wants to shut that down. It sees them as much more willing to support moderate Islamic groups like the Muslim Brotherhood and others, and sees those groups as its real challenge, right? Its real challenge is not the jihadists, it's not those that they can just lock up in prison or kill on admissions, it's those that have genuine political support from average people in their countries. And so the neighborhood, right, and particularly those that have a lot of money in that neighborhood, have tended to try to suppress the revolutions over time. And that's the regional challenge.
I'll mention another international actor, which is the United States. So Professor Mecham talked about the importance of institution building. Libya is sort of a shining example of the short-sightedness of American foreign policy, where we just sort of, play a leading role in bumping off Gaddafi and then turn and leave, and Libya becomes a basket case. So we don't have a very good long time horizons in American foreign policy, which causes problems.
In fact, President Obama at one point said that was his greatest foreign policy mistake as president, was not giving sufficient attention to the post-conflict governance issues in Libya. And so there is a lot that a country like the United States can do, but it requires sustained effort, and we can't expect overnight results either.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, well, please join me in thanking Professors Nelson and Mecham.